Now, last week, we were talking about being real with God. We were talking about on Palm Sunday that you had Jesus' disciples that obeyed him and followed him. But then you had this crowd come up out of nowhere. And they shouted for him and they cheered him and they said all the right things and did all the right things. And yet, when you really started to look into what the crowd was doing, they weren't glorifying God. They weren't in it for God. They were doing a bunch of things that looked right so that they would get what they want, but they weren't being real with God. They weren't being real with God. Well, at this point in the story, you see that Jesus has come. They have yelled to crucify him. He has been beaten beyond recognition. He was hung on a cross. And he died. And everyone saw it. Everyone saw it. And then he rose again from the dead. But you know, even though he did rise again from the dead, and people are talking about this, that didn't mean that everyone's doubts went away. And so that's what I wanted to talk about this morning. Because while you might have heard that Jesus rose from the grave, and while you might have heard last week, or maybe you're hearing for the first time, that you're supposed to be real with God, one of the questions that you probably have is, well, I'll be real with God when God is real with me. What do I mean by that? In other words, we're looking to God and we go, God, I have questions. And before I give my whole life and I'm really real with you and I do everything that you tell me to do, I need you to start to answer some of the doubts that I have. And even as I say that, it feels uncomfortable, right? We don't want to admit that we have doubts, but the truth is that everyone has doubts. There are questions you can't answer. And there are three reasons for your doubts. One is just logical. Maybe you're reading through the Bible and you see something that's different than what you thought about the Bible. And you start going, well, that doesn't fit what I think. That doesn't fit what I feel. And so you start to have doubts. Well, is this really true? Like, if this is who Jesus is, then how do I reconcile that in my mind? Or maybe you've been on social media and you see somebody who's smart and seems like it has it all together. And he starts saying things that are way different than what you've ever heard before. And you're going, man, I've never even heard this before. How do I know what's right and how do I know what's wrong? I mean, this guy, he looks smart. He has more degrees than the thermometer. And he just he really seems to know what he's talking about. He's really confident in it. So who's right? Another reason why you might have doubts is you might start to think about God and you go, man, life's just not fair. Why is it that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? Why is it, as we look at the news, there's war, and there's famine, and there's all these problems going on, and there's kids there? How is that fair? Another reason why you might have doubts is you start to look at your own life and you go, I have hurt in my life. Why did God take away my parent from me when I was so young? Why am I having to deal with all of these health issues that I used to be able to do this and that, and now the doctor's telling me I will never be able to do this and that ever again? How do I deal when a pastor or someone that I've trusted fails me in some way? It seems like every week now we read of another well-known pastor disqualifying himself, doing something we never thought that they would do. And they leave in their wake people who are hurt and confused. And it just starts to bring up all this doubt. And I want to say, if you're feeling that this morning, you're not alone. Not only are there people in this room that feel the same thing, there's people throughout the Bible that feel the same exact thing. And you might even say, well, Brant, I've never doubted. The Bible says it, God says it, that's what's true. But for being honest, life is complex. Life is hard, and doubts can come. So as we look at this text, we're going to look at someone named Thomas, who is a great follower of Jesus Christ, willing to give his life for Jesus Christ. But now the other disciples are coming to him and saying, Jesus is risen. He's risen indeed. And he says, I can't believe that. Until I see the scars and I touch them for myself, I'll never believe. So today we're talking about answers to your doubts. I'm going to read through, starting in verse 24. I'm going to read through 29 if you'll read along with me. It says, but Thomas, called Twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So after the other disciples were telling him, we've seen the Lord, but said to them, if I don't see the mark of the nails on his hands, put my finger into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I'll never believe. And a week later, his disciples were indoors again, and Thomas was with them. And even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Don't be faithless, but believe. And Thomas responded, my Lord and my God, Jesus said, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. There are two main things I want you to see from this. One, how do we encourage others who might have doubts? And the second is, who is really going to fix the doubts that I feel? How do I encourage others who have doubts? And who fixes the doubts that I feel? So my first point is this. You got to keep talking about Jesus. You got to keep talking about Jesus, right? Jesus had died in a really brutal way. And they had seen Jesus do all sorts of miracles, and they saw him raise Lazarus back to life. And yet the way that Jesus died, they said, no, this is impossible. This isn't happening. They saw that he was beaten till he was unrecognizable. They saw the crown of thorns pushed into his head. They saw that nails were driven through his hands and feet. They knew that his side was pierced with a spear, and they know that he was dead and buried in the tomb. Then Mary and the others and the other ladies, they go and they see the tomb is empty, and they tell the disciples, and the disciples see that the tomb is empty. And you have to imagine how crazy this is. The disciples go from thinking Jesus is going to lead them into some kind of awesome military victory, then he dies on a cross in a horrific way, and then now he's alive again. After they see Jesus, they realize that Thomas isn't with them, so what do? What do you do when you encounter Jesus? What do you do when you place your faith in Jesus? You have to tell others about Jesus. And so they go to Thomas. They go to Thomas. And this is what they say. They're basically saying, Thomas, we saw Jesus and he's risen. But they don't just do it once. They actually do it over and over again. This word for told here in verse 25 is an imperfect tense. You go, well, what does that mean? This is what it means. That the disciples aren't just telling, they keep on telling. That it's not like they went to Thomas once and he went, I don't even want to hear it. Like, I have to see it for myself, right? No. They went to Thomas and they said, Jesus is risen. And Thomas says, No, he didn't. He's dead. We all saw it. He's dead and he's buried. And they're saying, no, Thomas, you don't understand. The girls, they went to the tomb and they came back and we saw it. It's empty. He's risen. And they're saying, no, you didn't. He's dead and it's over. And they're saying, Thomas, buddy, we're serious. He rose and just like he said he would, which means that everything that Jesus has said is 100% true. And at that point, that Thomas goes, I don't want to hear this anymore. I don't want to hear this anymore. Unless he sees the mark of the nails in the side, he said he'll never believe. So why did the disciples keep sharing? Why did they continue to share? Because Jesus really did rise from the grave. That's a fact. Why did they share? Because that means that everything that Jesus had said is 100% true. And they also know that this truth is life-changing, and Thomas needs to know it, and Thomas needs to believe it. Now, here's a question. Did the disciples do the right thing by continuing to share about the risen Jesus Christ? I would argue yes. But I want you to notice, like the worst, our worst possible outcome when we're sharing with someone is that they're just like, I don't want to hear this anymore, and that we like turn them off and turn them away from the faith. That's what happened with Thomas. Like he's still wanting to hang out with them and stuff, but he's like, I don't want to hear this anymore. It's over, it didn't happen, stop bringing this up to me. And yet the disciples did bring it up to him. So did they do the right thing? Yes. Because it's the most important thing in life. To know Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sin and my sin, and that he rose 3 days later, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. It's just that important. You know, I remember as a kid, my parents would tell me things over and over. Brant, did you study for that test? Brant, did you do your homework? Now that I'm an adult, people ask me, did you get your taxes done? The deacons come to me, did you do this? Did you do that? Right? People are always telling me things. And why are they telling me over and over and over? Because it's important. If Jesus is really important to you and everything about Jesus is true, then you have to not only tell people about Jesus, you have to keep telling them about Jesus because it's that important. For my parents, they continue to say, did you do your homework until the homework was done? My dad would say, did you do the yard work until the yard work was done? My wife will now say, did you take out the trash until the trash is taken out? How important is Jesus to you? Is he more important than your kids doing well in school? Is he more important than just making sure you pay your taxes on time? Is he more important than your house stinking because the trash hasn't been taken out? If so, then we need to be telling about Jesus not once, but over and over again. One thing that I hear from people about why they don't share about Jesus is because they're afraid that they're going to nag people and turn them away. But the fact is that we don't share because we are either apathetic to the lost or we are fearful what others might think. That's the only reasons. That either you think it's fine if they die, and God will judge them and everything that comes with that. Or we're too concerned what they think about us than them actually being right with God. Some of you do share and have shared, but you're scared of nagging. You know what? How many testimonies have you heard that someone came up here and they said, I'm so glad that so-and-so stopped sharing Jesus with me? 0. I've heard 0 testimonies like that. You know what most testimonies I hear is people saying, and I'm so glad that someone kept sharing Jesus with me, kept inviting me, wouldn't leave me alone, calling me at my house, knocking on the door on Sundays, and they kept after me and after me and after me. Whenever we started to kind of talk about religion, I started to back out. They pulled me back in. That's the testimonies that I hear. That's the lives that I see changed. If that's the case, then we need to keep sharing Jesus. Not once, but over and over and over again. You know, there's definitely ways that you can invite and share without being annoying, right? But do not neglect to share. You know, we often get in our heads about sharing Jesus. Will I know enough? Will I explain everything good enough? Will I be persuasive enough? And I want you to hear, the truth is, we can share with no worries, because you know who actually squashes the doubt You know who actually reveals to people the truth? It's not you. It's not how you spoke about Jesus. It's not about what you taught. Only Jesus can reveal himself. This is my second point. Only Jesus can reveal himself. Thomas has doubts. Because if you're being honest, and I'm being honest, none of this makes any sense. Right? He has doubts logically. Because he knows Jesus is dead. He knows Jesus is in the tomb. It's over. You want to know why it's not logically making sense to Thomas? It's because Thomas, as you start to look at him, is having a hard time understanding because he thinks the way to God is through his own efforts. Let me prove what I'm talking about. In John chapter 14, verses 1 through 7, this is what Jesus is talking. I want you to see what Thomas has to say. Jesus says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. And if it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and I will take you myself, so that where I'm going, you may be also. You know the way to where I'm going." And Thomas says, "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" Jesus just said, "Don't worry about it. I'm coming back and I'm going to take you myself. You don't even have to know the way. The way is me." Jesus is saying, I'm the way because I'm going to take you and put you exactly where you need to be. And yet Thomas is going, "Well, how can we do that? I don't even know where we're going." Because Thomas wants to figure out how to do it himself. And so Jesus responds to him, "I am the way. You want to know the way? I'm the way. I'm the truth. I'm the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will also know the Father. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him." It's hard for Thomas to wrap his mind around that he can't do anything to be right with God. That Jesus is going to do all of the work. And so when he sees that Jesus is dead and he wasn't there to die with him, that he was scared and run away, he goes, "It's over." Jesus rising from the dead? Jesus forgiving me of my sins? No, I haven't done enough. I don't know how to do that myself because it's impossible for him to do it himself. Jesus dying to take his place does not make sense to Thomas because he still thinks that gaining God's favor is all on himself. Thomas is also doubting because he's so hurt. In John chapter 11, Jesus tells them he's going to Judea, and we find out that it's going to be to raise Lazarus from the dead. And all of his disciples say, "Don't go back to Judea. Don't. The Jewish leaders are waiting for you. They're going to stone you, they're going to kill you, and they're going to kill us." And Jesus says, "I'm going." And then Thomas speaks up. I mean, look at this faith that he has. Despite the obvious danger, Thomas speaks up and says, "Let's go too, that we may die with him." I mean, this guy, he's willing to die with Jesus. And yet, now we see after Jesus' death, he's thinking it's all over. The one he was going to follow, the one who was going to be the Messiah and make life all right, is now dead and gone. And he is hurt by it. His idea was following Jesus not into just death itself, but maybe into a battle. Maybe to take over the Jewish leadership. But this idea that Jesus would just die for, in his opinion, nothing, it hurt. It hurt. Now when the disciples are saying that he's alive, it feels like salt being poured into an open wound. You know, he's also hurt because it's not fair. They thought that Jesus was going to make them like kings, put them in the best positions. And yet, now they find themselves in a much worse position, possibly being killed for their faith. living in danger, living in exile. Instead of health, wealth, and prosperity and reigning, Thomas finds himself leaderless, hopeless, in danger, and without a cause. And look, maybe you're experiencing what Thomas is today. You've heard something and it's just not sitting right with you and you have doubts. Maybe you've experienced something and it's just hurtful that someone you were supposed to look up to has failed you in some way and you're doubting. Maybe you just are starting to think about Jesus and you go, well, this isn't fair. Why would a good God do this? And I want you to hear this today. That if Jesus rose from the grave, there are answers to all of your questions. And there are answers to all of your doubts. Even if you might not know the answers yet. Because look, maybe you came to visit your mom for Easter and she wanted you to come to church, but honestly you don't know what to think about this Jesus stuff. Maybe you have these deep questions and having a hard time working through. Maybe you think life isn't fair. Maybe you've been disappointed by the church before. And it took a lot for you to even enter those doors this morning. But even in Thomas's disbelief, he comes to him and he shows him the wounds. Which probably doesn't answer every single one of Thomas's questions, but this is why we can be confident that all of our doubts, all of our questions have answers. Because if Jesus Christ came, lived a sinless life, and then he died on the cross, and then rose again 3 days later, there is a purpose for all of your pain. There are answers to all of your questions. There are things that we can't even wrap our mind around, but we can trust God. Based on what we do know. Let me give you a really good definition of faith this morning. This is faith. Trusting in what you don't understand based on what you do understand. That's my definition of faith. Trusting what I don't understand based on what I do understand. When you sat in these pews today, did you understand all the physics of why it would hold you up? Did you check the screws to make sure they were in the ground right? No. But you said, this is a chair, and chairs are made for sitting. You get in your car to come here, and you're going to get in your car to leave. Do you know what a carburetor does? Did you check all your fluids? Do you know how a car works in every single way? For most of us, check engine light goes on. We're like, we'll keep driving. Why? Because cars are made for driving. And because I know that, I can have faith. Some of you will even get on airplanes. You'll book a ticket, spend all this money to get on this big metal tube that'll fly through the sky. Do you know aerodynamics? Do you know all these physics? No. You know the airplanes are made for flying. And that's what you need to do. That's faith. Faith is having trust in what I don't understand based on what I do understand. For Jesus, when he rose from the grave, we can be sure that all of our hurts, all of our pains, all of our questions have answers. Because if Jesus is alive, that means that God is real. That means that God really loves us. That means that salvation is attainable because Jesus, who is fully God, fully man, lived a sinless life, and he died on the cross for a purpose. And he rose from the grave that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting, everlasting life. No matter what your doubts are, no matter the place in your heart where you want to turn from God, Jesus' resurrection will give you the answers you need so that you can trust the things you don't understand based on the truths you know about Jesus. Here's my main point. Jesus' resurrection gives you answers. Jesus' resurrection gives us answers. You might be having so many questions today. Where do dinosaurs fit in the Bible? Why is there so much suffering in the world? Why has God allowed me to get in an abusive relationship when I was younger? Why did God let my parent die of cancer when I was young? Why is my health declining while others are doing just fine? We could ask so many questions to God, but if the resurrection is true, we could trust that God has every answer. Because God is real. Sin separates us from God. Jesus came to save, and the resurrection confirms the salvation that we could have through Jesus Christ, and that all other questions we could have beautiful, wonderful answers. let me tell you about one more thing. I'm aware what time it is and everything, but I want you to hear this. In Acts chapter 4, Peter and John are going around and they're preaching the gospel. And they're preaching it as true. And then the Sanhedrin, that's all the smartest Jewish people, they all get together and they obviously are hearing what they're saying and maybe even asking questions. And we see in Acts chapter 4, it says that they see their boldness, but they notice that they're uneducated and untrained men. In other words, why are they speaking so bold? They haven't had training, they haven't had education. Surely they can't have the answers to all of my questions. So they threaten them. Don't talk about Jesus anymore. You don't know what you're talking about. People start asking questions, you're not going to have the answers for them. You're uneducated, you're untrained. Stop talking about Jesus. This is what it says. Peter and John tells them, whether it's right in the sight of God for us to listen to you rather than to God, you decide. For we are unable to stop speaking about what we have seen and what we have heard. In other words, they might not have all the answers right there. But they do know that Jesus rose from the grave. So they accept what they cannot understand based on what they do understand. I might not know what your big theological words mean. I might not know the things that person I saw on social media that's talking all smart knows. I might not understand everything, but I do understand that Jesus rose from the grave. And if I can accept that fact, then I can trust that God will take care of the rest. Here's my challenge for you this Easter. I want you to just ask yourself, how does Jesus' resurrection change how I live my life? Because again, if Jesus' resurrection is the answer to all my doubts, it's because Jesus' resurrection should change my entire life. And if I'm being honest with myself, as I think about how Jesus' resurrection changed my life, it's not enough. Because I'm still worried about money. I'm still worried about my kids. I'm still worried about all these other things that are happening. And more than that, when hurt comes into my life, I don't trust in God with the hurt that He's going to do something great with it. I whine and I complain and I really worry myself over it. But the truth is that if Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead, it should change everything about my life. That I don't know why I'm experiencing this hurt, but I can trust that God is good and He loves me and He's going to take care of me. I don't know why you got laid off at your job and why you're having trouble with your money. But I could trust that Jesus Christ died, was resurrected, and that He sees your hurt and He sees your pain and He's working through it. I don't know why the things that have happened to you have happened. But when you allow the resurrection of Jesus to change your whole life, and you start to be real with God, then you can walk in real faith. This is what Jesus has to say about it. He says, take on my yoke because it's easy and it's light. How is that possible? Because when I trust in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, everything else falls in line. I don't have to do it myself. Life isn't all about me. It's all about God working through me. It's all about God taking care of the things that I can't take care of. That includes my salvation, yes. And it also includes every aspect of my life. Here's the truth. Jesus Christ saw us in your separation from God. Saw how you were trying to live life way away from God. And you started going in all these other brokenness and think that life is about your job and life is about your kids and life is about finding a relationship and life is about finding your own happiness or other people thinking highly of you or just pleasures in general. And He says, I want to rescue those people because they're separated from God and they can't come back. So He came, fully God, fully man, born of a virgin, lived a sinless life and died on that cross for your sin and my sin that we might be reconciled. That means brought back together with God so that we could live out what we were created to. And that's living a life of worshiping God and a life in relationship with God. Let me just say, you could accept that today. If you've had doubts today and you see how the resurrection can kind of cover those and you're saying, you know what? I could put those doubts to the side if I believe this. Today is your day to finally accept the Lord Jesus Christ for yourself. If you've accepted the Lord Jesus Christ yourself, today is the day to say, you know what, God, I've been living for all this other stuff and I've been worried about all this other stuff and I've had all these doubts and questions about this other stuff, but I believe in the resurrection. And so I can believe that you got it taken care of based on what you've done on the cross and from you rising on the grave. Today is your day that you can pray and you could get right back with God. Either way, if you would like to give your life to Jesus Christ, if you would like prayer from me, I would love to pray for you right up here. Jasper, we got another song? Then we're going to stand and we're going to sing together. As you stand, I'm going to pray, and now is your time to be right back with the Lord.